Okay, next up under microprofiles is fault tolerance. Go ahead.
So fault tolerance is a spec that's meant for, well, as it says, fault tolerance, but the idea is especially like immediately comes up in microservice applications where, for example, you might have 10 different components and one or two might be down while the rest are up. At first blush, when I was looking into this, I was thinking, oh, well, Domino is usually either up or catastrophically down. So it doesn't really matter if like a component is up because it's usually all or nothing. However, this does have potential uses even in any app on Domino or just in general, because, for example, if you're accessing a remote resource, that might be down while your service is up, or you might just have uses for these capabilities themselves. So the fault tolerance specification includes a handful of different things that I've added in here. So the first one is fault tolerance retry support. So looking at this, it doesn't look like much, but if I go to the code backing this, then here, what this is doing is it's calling this fault tolerance bean that says get failing. So the get failing method here, all it does is throw an exception saying this is expected to fail. So what you would normally have if you call this method is that the exception would propagate up to the top and then you would have an exception. However, I'm saying I will allow up to 2 retries, and if it still doesn't work after 2 tries, go to this other method that now says I am the fallback response. So this all happened automatically because I annotated on this bean saying this you can try up to twice, and here's a fallback. It automatically happened. So when I went to that resource, it said, okay, call this method. It threw an exception. So it said, okay, I can try again. Call the method, throws an exception. And then now it says, okay, it still doesn't work. Go to this fallback. So you can imagine this for a remote resource or something that is periodically down. You can say, well, allow retries. Like, so if a remote resource, and we've all encountered these sorts of things, works almost all the time, but then every once in a while will fail, you could say, I'll try this up to 3 times. And then if it doesn't work after that, then either throw the real exception or have a different message saying this is down. So this is something that you can use in all sorts of situations. One of the neat things with this and some of the other specifications here is that I'm using this in a bean here, like it happened to have been used in a REST service, but it's not specific to REST services. So for example, if I was calling this from an XPage, it would work the same exact way. So if you had an XPage that was calling this and then it failed, the XPage would try again and again because these are all managed by CDI. And as far as XPages is concerned, it's just calling this method, but it's sort of a magic method that handles all of this. So that's one of the cases where here it's really about usually like a remote service thing, but you could easily imagine some sort of situation internally where you have something that's a little faulty, but not purely faulty. So you might want to have this kind of capability. The next one is timeout. So over here, I have this timeout thing that I'm expecting to eventually say, oh, this timed out. So what this means is that I can declare this method as having a maximum execution time that's allowed. So I said here that I'm allowing this to run for up to 5 milliseconds. And then in the code, I say sleep for 10 milliseconds, so it will always fail. What this is useful for is, for example, if you have something that will either succeed quickly or will linger and eventually fail. Like, for example, sometimes it'll have an infinite loop, which we write those all the time in Domino. Sometimes it will just be something where it's like a network request, like if you know that it is doing a DNS lookup, and sometimes like at the client domain, either like maybe the VPN went down or whatever, that kind of thing will either immediately succeed or will fail very slowly. You can put a timeout on that saying, well, I'm only going to allow 5 seconds for this, which almost all the time is going to be exactly what's needed or way, way more than what's needed. But if it's failing, I know it's never going to succeed in more than 5 seconds. So I can put a timeout here. So this is a way of saying this is a fault-prone method, and the way it fails is that sometimes it just takes a very long time. So I can throw in this this timeout annotation, and then the stack will enforce this. And then it will, if it goes beyond that, it will interrupt it and it will tell you, like, here is, this was caused by a timeout. So you can handle that specially if your calling code knows about it. But even if it doesn't, like, this will just put a cap on how long this is going to run. So if you know your code is going to be potentially faulty because it's tricky code, or you're dealing with something that is itself potentially faulty, you can put a cap there as a way to know this is a case where something might go wrong very commonly, and this is a common idiom that will be able to deal with that.
Yeah, I can see this as being one of those things that everybody just has in their toolbox and knows how it works. And then as you're, say you're testing or something like that, you're not expecting things to go wrong, but if they do, this is a really quick way of putting something in to kind of confirm that.
Yeah, like realistically, there's not much reason to not put this on every method that where you have an idea of how long it's going to take. Like, especially if you know you're going into something where it's like, all right, this is going to be a complicated thing. This is a meaty method that there's going to be a lot, like in Domino with the normal API, you tend to start with an infinite loop and then do the doc equals view.getNext document or whatever. And so if you're writing a lot of those, eventually you're going to forget. And then on Domino, when you're in an infinite loop in a web request, you have to like kill the process at the OS level. So if you put one of these on there ahead of time, which has to be ahead of time, unfortunately, then that will at least cap it off and say, okay, well, it's not going to run for more than 10 minutes. So at the very least, this will be your maximum.
Yeah, if you've got a a database that you're acting on that say whatever the number is, 10,000 documents, if it's got more than 10,000 documents, you automatically put this into your code.
Right. Yes, that's perfect. Yeah, and then especially because there are lots of situations where you'll run an agent and you're like, this is taking longer than it should. What is happening? This is bad. So as long as you remember to do this first, and so like in theory you could annotate everything with this. You probably won't, but like as long as you get into the habit of like, I know I'm asking for trouble with this one, so I will put a cap on it. So that can definitely handle that. And then the final component of fault tolerance that I have in here is circuit breaker. So this is an interesting capability where, let's see if it's working. I was fiddling with my dev environment, so we'll see if it's still working. Yes, it did. So what happened there was that I clicked on the circuit breaker link 3 times. It worked normally the first 2 times, and then on the third run, it failed. So what this is saying is I have this circuit breaker annotation that says, I'm allowed to have 2 requests within 60 seconds. So this is milliseconds. So it's 60,000 milliseconds. And then, so here, what it's normally doing is just throwing this exception that says, actually, this is working fine. But then on the third attempt, it said circuit breaker is open in circuit terms. But then if I were to wait 60 seconds and try it again, it will work. So the idea here is that you are building in a certain amount of, you could say like DOS protection, although, ideally this wouldn't be in this level, but like that's the kind of idea where, like, for example, if something is going to be an extremely expensive operation, but could potentially be hit by multiple users, like if it's something that like processes all documents in a giant database, you might want to say only allow this once every however many minutes. Like there are other mechanisms for some of these things like synchronization, but this is something where, like, again, if it's accessing a remote service or it's something where it can be run by multiple people, but you don't want it to run that fast, or you could see it for something like if you're doing a, for example, if you're doing something that like submits a purchase, you might want to say there's a circuit breaker of only allowing 1 every 10 milliseconds or something, like in a range where a computer would easily make that request multiple times, but a user won't. So you could say, I want to allow for a user length, like human length amount of time in between requests. So if somebody hits submit multiple times, but you want to block if they accidentally double submit, or if a browser double submits, or a script runs this multiple times. So it will automatically handle that, and it tracks the amount of time that's passed and all the windows and that sort of thing. So it automatically puts a cap in there, and then once the amount of time passes, if it hasn't had that many within that amount of time, you're good. So if it says every 10 milliseconds and they come in every 11 milliseconds, it will work 100% of the time. But if it comes in twice within that window, if you had set it that way, then it will stop. And then and then restore itself. Like, so after that time, like it won't break the method indefinitely, it will come back. So it's just meant to be like, I just want to put a cap on how much this specifically can be run. So this is another one where it's like, yeah, you're not always going to have a situation where you're going to use this, but when you do, these are some pretty powerful capabilities. And again, these will work in any bean that you do with CDI. So if you have your managed beans done with CDI, you can put this on there. It'll work in REST services, it'll work in XPages, it'll work in anything else we add. So anything that's running within this runtime that's using these beans will have this capability. You can just annotate it on any method, and any of these, you can combine these if you want. But these are basically adding extra powers for either handling likely problems that you might have or likely problems that a remote service might have. And it just adds these additional capabilities without a lot of code. Like you don't have to write anything that handles, did I run within the last 10 seconds? You can just say, don't allow this. And
yeah.
I find this extremely powerful. Like, and now I'm just looking for a situation where I'm going to put this to use, because like I can imagine scenarios, and as soon as one of these comes up, it's like, I will do this rather than having to write my own thing.